Radicalism and Feminism.
19th century Europe, a world where ordinary people, the working class and women alike, were denied a voice in shaping their own future. Radicalism was the main political idea in the 19th century, aiming to increase political and economic equality. In the mid-19th century, feminism, referred to as a social and political movement advocating for women's rights and gender equality, focusing on gaining legal rights like access to education, property ownership, and the right to vote. Radicals in Great Britain were Chartists and Republicans who demanded universal male suffrage and full citizenship without regard to wealth and property ownership. Some even argued that such rights should be extended to women.
Chartists supported a working-class movement in Britain during the 1830s and the 1840s. Their aim was to gain political rights and influence for the working classes. Their demands were widely publicized through their meetings and pamphlets. The movement got its name from the People's Charter, which had listed its main goals: universal male suffrage or vote for all men over 21, secret ballots, annual parliaments, abolition of property requirements for a member of parliament, more equal and fair representations in parliament and governments, payments for members of the parliament, electoral districts of equal size, and annual elections for parliament. They wanted this because they longed for economic equality, political rights, and influence over the working classes. In the end, their demands were rejected. Chartism did not directly generate any reforms. However, after 1848, as the movement faded, its demands appeared less threatening and were gradually enacted by other reformers. In England, in 1811 and 1812, a band of handloom weavers wrecked factory machinery and burned mills in the Midland, Yorkshire, and Lancashire, protesting against industries that replaced skilled labor with machines. The rioters also sent threatening letters to employers, attacked magistrates and food merchants, along with using large sledgehammers to attack frames. In an attempt to restore order and protection of the industry, the government sent an army of 12,000 soldiers and made machine wrecking punishable by death. They also started to hang and deport protesters. These rioters were called Luddites after the fictional figure General Ned Ludd, who supposedly led the movement and whose signature appeared on their declarations.
In society, women were excluded from political movements and confined to domestic roles, where they were expected to manage households, raise children, and maintain family structures. Their access to education and economic opportunities were limited, making it difficult for women to assert any kind of independence or voice in public matters. Moreover, the Industrial Revolution and rapid urbanization led to the exploitation of many women in factories, where they worked long hours in unsafe conditions for minimal wages. Poverty, combined with the lack of opportunities, forced many women into prostitution as a means of survival, as they had no other way to earn money. This situation led to the rise of women's movements that fought for legal reforms, improved working conditions, and equal rights. Feminist thinkers such as Mary Wollstonecraft advocated for women's education and equality, especially in her vindication of the rights of women. Olympe de Gouges pushed for equal rights for women during the French Revolution with her Declaration of the Rights of Women, and Flora Tristan connected women's rights to workers' rights and highlighted the economic and social oppression among women as seen in women and the working class.
During this time, there were supporters and opponents of radicalism and feminism. Supporters of these movements were working-class men who benefited from Chartist demands for political inclusion, as they saw the expansion of suffrage and greater representation as a way to challenge political power. Women in cooperative movements, particularly those who advocated for equality within unions and workplaces, were also supporters. These women not only pushed for women's suffrage, but also sought to address the systematic discrimination they faced in labor markets, including unequal pay, long hours, and poor working conditions. They fought for equal participation in decision-making processes within labor organizations and cooperative initiatives. Socialists who viewed women's emancipation as a key part of social progress were also supporters. For socialists, the struggle for gender equality was also closely tied to their broader visions of overthrowing capitalist structures, which they saw as exploiting both women and the working classes. Opponents of these movements were industrialists and elites who feared that any significant economic or political shifts, such as women's participation in the workforce or political life, would disrupt established power structures. Many saw women's rights movements as a direct threat to their dominance in both the economy and politics, fearing a loss of control over labor forces. There were also conservative politicians who opposed threats to traditional structures and hierarchies, including gender roles that placed women in domestic positions. These politicians argued that allowing women into the political arena or the workforce would destabilize family structure and undermine societal order, viewing feminism as a challenge to the conservative values that had long governed society. Religious groups also opposed radicalism and feminism as they had become accustomed to traditional beliefs about gender roles, often arguing that a woman's place was in the home and that their involvement in radical movements or the workforce was against natural order. These groups sometimes used moral and religious justifications to oppose feminist movements, prompting the idea that women should focus on family and motherhood rather than engaging in social or political activism.
Radical ideas advocating for women's rights and broader social reform initially failed due to a combination of factors. Radical movements were often led by marginalized groups such as working-class women and socialists who lacked political power and influence and who were strongly opposed by elites. There was also a fear of destabilization following the French Revolution, where many conservatives feared that any radical movements advocating for women's rights or social reforms could lead to a similar upheaval in their own countries. Among these, there were deeply ingrained gender roles, where at the time society's view was rigidly defined, with women largely confined to domestic areas and men to public, economic, and political communities. These factors, combined with opposition from powerful societal forces, ensured that radical feminist and social reform ideas would initially struggle to gain widespread support or achieve lasting change.
The radical demands and feminist movements of the 19th century in Europe went on to shape the political, social, and cultural landscapes of the modern world. These early movements changed old systems of power and inequality, along with many of their key ideas becoming fundamental in the years that followed. One of the most important legacies of European radicalism was the fight for universal suffrage. The demand for a vote for all men eventually evolved into the broader struggle for women's suffrage. The battles for the right to vote reshaped the political landscape of Europe and ensured that the voices of all citizens, regardless of their gender or social status, were heard. Radical feminism in the 19th century Europe advocated for gender equality, particularly focusing on women's suffrage, education, and their employment. The demand for equal opportunities in employment and the fight against discriminatory labor laws was central to their movement. These advances laid the groundwork for the gender equality we see today in many European countries, where women have access to education, equal pay, and opportunities to enter any workforce. The radical 19th century movements in Europe not only sparked a change during their time, but also left a mark on modern social justice movements. Many fights and activist movements are drawn from the radical ideas of equality, freedom, and justice that were demanded in the 19th century.
In 19th century Europe, radical and feminist movements challenged political and social inequalities. Radicals like the Chartists and Luddites fought for universal suffrage and workers' rights, while feminists advocated for women's legal rights, education, and better working conditions. Despite facing strong opposition, these movements laid the foundation for future reforms, including women's suffrage and gender equality. A few words to remember are equality, the core demand of both radical and feminist movements, suffrage, a unifying goal, the right to vote in political elections, and industrial exploitation, the cause for reform and certain outbursts.